Hello, I'm Robert Teeter, Chief Investment Strategist here at Silvercrest, and I'm joined by Patrick Chovanec, our Economic Advisor. And today we're going to be talking about Saudi Arabia. So for some context, Saudi Arabia has a GDP of about $1 trillion, and its allocation in the Morgan Stanley All-Country World Index is about 0.5%. However, the sovereign fund's an active global investor, and Saudi Arabia certainly punches above its weight when it comes to global policy. So, Patrick, let's first start with some of your observations from your travels to Saudi Arabia.
Yes, I have had the chance to travel to Saudi Arabia, and out of all the countries that I've visited, I think second only to North Korea, which I have been to, and that's a different conversation.
Yes, that will
for
be a good
another
one.
day. It was the hardest for me to really wrap my mind around as a travel experience. Partly because it is a very modern country. When you go there, there are skyscrapers, there are beautiful airports, there are malls, there are all the consumer brands and fast food brands that you would recognize, which is unusual actually for most of the Middle East. And yet, scratching that surface, and it doesn't take much to scratch that surface, you encounter a very traditional tribal society, pre-modern society that hasn't changed, even as its economy has become one of the top 20 largest economies in the world.
Right.
And essentially what happened was, if you go back to the founder of Saudi Arabia, he was a tribal leader in the desert with a fort and camels. And he did carve out a kingdom, but what transformed it was the discovery of oil. Right. And the way tribal society works is you have a tribal chief who maintains his position by handing out patronage to his retainers. And oil became just another form of patronage. Essentially, you took it out of the ground, or you hired foreigners to take it out of the ground, and then you continued to run your tribe. And that allowed them, you gave them the produce of that, and they continued to live their traditional way of life, which was a pre-modern way of life. And if you needed people to sort of service a modern economy, you brought in foreigners. I encountered Filipinos there who were working, and whether they're drivers or working at retail shops, that's the workforce, not your domestic population. So it is a really different kind of country, and it presents very serious challenges going forward.
That's fascinating. I have not been and would like to go sometime. There's some great observations. Maybe let's transition a bit to, there's been some transformation and vision in Saudi Arabia, and be interesting to get your thoughts on sort of how the leader has come to those views and what they're looking to do and accomplish. And MBS has laid out a lot of plans, and would love to get your thoughts on his vision.
Right. The Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, known as MBS, and we'll just call him MBS from this point on. He is a very controversial figure. He's authoritarian, rules with an iron fist, but is also trying to rapidly modernize and reform Saudi Arabia. And what that means is not entirely clear. The big driving force behind that is that the model that I just described, where you live off the oil and nothing else changes, is just not sustainable going forward. There is always the concern in Saudi Arabia, what happens if the oil runs out? Right. But now the concern is, what happens when the world transitions away from fossil fuels, develops new technologies that compete, and then Saudi Arabia, that goose that lays the golden eggs, is no longer there. If you want to remain a first world country, if you want to remain in the top 20 of the global economy with the per capita income that reflects that, you're going to have to change the whole way that you do business. You can no longer just look to oil. You have to develop other sectors. But that means that you have to have a society that's capable of doing that.
Right.
And that is exactly what's missing in Saudi Arabia right now. So one of the things that they're doing, obviously, is investing heavily. The reason why they took Aramco, which is the national oil company, public, was to tap capital both externally and internally to try to invest in education, to try to invest in specific industries that they want to
Hmm.
develop. But it's easier to build hardware than it is to build software. And so you have this pre-modern society that somehow has got to populate this modern economy and
Right.
make it work. That is a huge challenge because if you can have malls, you can have universities that are sparkling, but what happens when the women have to sit in a separate room and can only watch the professor over a video?
Hmm.
What happens when you have, as this is the case in Saudi Arabia, separate office buildings for men and women? How do you run in a modern economy that way?
Right.
And so if you think back to Peter the Great in Russia, right? He saw the modern world. He saw what that had to be like, and he, in a very authoritarian, sometimes ruthless way,
Hmm.
tried to grab Russia and move it into the rest of Europe.
Right.
And that was it was a brutal and difficult and wrenching process. And I think that that's exactly what Saudi Arabia faces right now, uh, because we had hundreds of years to adapt.
Right.
From if you go back to the Middle Ages, there was a different way of life, different cultural custom norms, and then if you go forward to say 1800, you have the novels of Jane Austen,
Hmm.
and they describe this society that's in transition, where people, when they get married, instead of that being a family allegiance to preserve property, now young people are getting out and interacting with each
Right.
other and falling in love,
Hmm.
right? And that was a transition that she described, and it wasn't comfortable for people,
Right.
which is why it makes for good stories. But we, even now, 200 years later, we've had that many more years to gradually evolve into a modern society.
Right.
And you might like some of the things that have resulted, you might not like some of the things, but it's to do it over the course of 100 years. Saudi Arabia faces the challenge of doing that over the course of a few decades,
Right.
and not everybody's happy about it.
Yeah, it's a lot of change coming very quickly and a lot of required change.
And they're sitting really on a volcano. They've known this since an event that took place that most Americans don't remember, don't know about,
Mm.
which was in 1979, the seizure of Mecca by radical Islamists. And this was
Mhm.
back in 1979, so
Okay.
around the same time as the Iranian Revolution.
Yes.
And that was before Osama bin Laden, before Al Qaeda,
Mhm.
before 9/11, and the Saudi participants in that. That
Mhm.
was the early warning sign that something was amiss,
Mhm.
that this clash of modernity and pre-modernity was not everyone was comfortable, and it
Right.
could spill over into radicalism and violence.
Yeah.
And so ever since then, the Saudi royals have known that they are sitting on a volcano. And that's
Mhm.
something to really digest, the reality that the 19th or 20th largest economy in the world, which is the third largest producer of oil,
Mhm.
is sitting on a giant volcano.
Yes. Yes. Very challenging and interesting and dynamic times. Let's maybe pivot a little bit to talking about Saudi Arabia's role in the Mideast specifically, as a important participant in all of the geopolitics that go on there. Would be interested in your thoughts on where they sit in the region in terms of influence and alliances and things like that.
This is not your father's Middle East. I think that many of us of our age grew up in a Middle East that was not in a, but around the talking
Hmm.
about a
Yeah.
Middle East that was inherited from the 1950s and
Yep.
60s, where the big players in those decades were the large population countries:
Mhm.
Egypt, Syria,
Right.
Iraq. They were the big players because they could field large militaries.
Hmm.
And the central issue in the Arab world at that time was the creation of Israel and the Arab Israeli conflict.
Hmm.
And there were numerous wars in which each of these countries got involved and fought Israel over this question.
Right.
the banking center at that time of the Middle East was Lebanon. But of course, it was torn apart by all these divisions, and lost that status. And then what happened around the 1970s was you started to see the emergence of these petrostates, these countries that had become rich by selling oil. Iran, which is not an Arab country, so it has its own complications, but certainly Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, UAE, Kuwait. And I think the Gulf War sort of represented that transition point from one Middle East to the other. And so now what you've seen is actually that these countries, Saudi Arabia, a revolutionary Iran, the UAE, Qatar, have now become, because of their money, the big powers.
Right.
Turkey, the previous colonial overlord, sort of sits there and maintains an interest. But after the Arab Spring, there were a whole series of wars which took place, Libya, Syria, continuing in Lebanon. And these became proxy wars between these rich countries. And so the previous countries, which were Egypt, Iraq, Syria, that once were the powerhouses in the Middle East, became the battlefields, where proxy wars between these countries, these richer countries, were being played out. And one of the big clashes recently is between little Qatar, which is very rich because of natural gas, and their big Saudi neighbors, because they're very frequently at odds. But the really big conflict and divide in the Middle East is now between the Saudis and the Iranians. And that's where we see this transformation of the Israeli-Palestinian issue, because if you're Saudi Arabia and the big issue is Iran, Israel is a natural partner, if not ally. And that is where this normalization between some of the Arab states and Israel has come about. It's not because of wizardry of American diplomacy. It's because these countries now, the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
I was just going to say.
And that is now the new alignment.
Right.
And there was some speculation with the recent outbreak of violence in Gaza that this would drive a wedge between the Israelis and the Saudis. It has not. And that's because of Iran.
Right. So let's focus in maybe on U.S.-Saudi relations for a bit, and how the U.S. fits into this, and relations with Saudi in the past and going forward.
It's challenging because so the view during the Trump administration was sort of to go all in with Saudi Arabia and Israel as partners. The only time that became awkward was with Qatar, because we actually have our largest military base is in Qatar. And so when the Saudis and the Qataris were at odds, that put us in a little bit of an awkward position that we didn't expect. But there's, in the Democratic Party under Biden, there's a little bit more skepticism that either what the Israelis want to do or what the Saudis want to do is always in U.S. interest. So that's where you've seen some tension recently between MBS and the Biden administration. Another thing that plays into that is oil. The way that Saudi Arabia became a U.S. ally actually originated in the 1970s, or it became when it became our primary ally in the Middle East. It began in the 1970s with not the Iranian Revolution, but the Shah of Iran. The Shah of Iran had very grandiose ideas about what the role that Persia, Iran was going to play in the Middle East. It was going to be the power, the regional power. And he was our guy, and so we kind of went along with that. But one thing that he did to support that was he wanted a much higher price for oil. And the Saudis came in and said, we'll undercut that, and we'll be your primary partner. The reason why the Saudis always wanted a moderate price for oil was because they realized that if they had too high a price, that the world would shift away from oil. Now, two things have happened. First, the United States becoming the largest oil producer in the world because of shale. And secondly, the movement towards these new technologies, where I think the Saudis feel, well, we need to squeeze whatever we can out of this while we've still got it to help with this transition. So the tendency to say, let's play the long game and keep oil prices moderate, that's gone away. And the temptation is now for them to align with Russia, for instance, as the other largest oil producer in the world, and say, let's keep the oil price up,
Right.
which in the wake of the Ukraine war created some real tensions.
Definitely some tension.
where the U.S. said, hey, we've got these sanctions against Russia that's going to boost the oil price. Hey, Saudis, come in and help us out. And they said, no, we actually have more in common with Russia on this point. So there's been this divide. It's partly been because of the partisan difference in the United States in terms of attitudes towards Israel and Saudi Arabia, but also because of just how the Saudis see their future. And remember, now their main customer, the main customer for Persian Gulf oil is China.
Right.
And China's been sort of missing in the equation, but it's appearing more and more to say, well, we're your major customers, so maybe pay attention to what we think.
Right. Well, while we're there with China and oil, it's probably a good time to start thinking about petrodollars. So we all hear about this. We've been hearing about it for a while. Why don't you start with giving us the background on what is this concept and how does it relate to oil prices and geopolitics?
Well, I'll relate the narrative that I disagree with and I think is wrong.
Yeah.
But it's important to understand this narrative because you'll hear it a lot among people who chatter about markets. Right. And it's that after Nixon abandoned the gold standard, that the dollar was in big trouble. And the Saudis essentially stepped in, and as part of a political deal, that we would defend them and provide protection, and that they would ensure that the dollar was enshrined as the payment for oil, and so this was a quid pro quo. And a lot of people now have been asking, okay, well, if the U.S. and China, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia are not entirely aligned, at what point will the Saudis say, forget it, we're switching and dropping the dollar and going to the renminbi or something like that? I don't think that's really what happened back in the 1970s. I think if you look at it closely and if you understand how currencies work, the Saudis did step in and say, we will be the provider of oil. But their motivation for approaching the U.S. Treasury Department to buy treasuries was not, we're doing you a favor, but we need you to do us a favor.
Right.
If we're going to be selling all this oil and be your main partner, we're going to end up with a bunch of dollars.
Yes.
And we need to do something with those dollars. We do want dollars because compared to any other currency in the world, if you have massive amounts of money to invest, you want dollars. Largest capital markets in the world, most liquid. So that's what you want. You don't necessarily want renminbi. You don't necessarily want yen. You don't necessarily want euros. You want dollars. And a lot of those things haven't, the reason for that hasn't changed. So the Saudis needed a place to put their dollars. It wasn't that the U.S. needed the Saudis to take our dollars. They were going to take our dollars. They needed a place to put it. And that has led to the two countries being intertwined financially to a great degree. Will that change? I don't think it will change because of politics. I don't think the Saudis will simply say, we're closer to China now than we are to the U.S., so we're dropping the dollar. I think it might change if the status of currencies and the security of currencies change. So the United States, there's been a lot of talk recently about weaponizing the U.S. dollar, using it as leverage, using access to the dollar into U.S. financial markets and U.S. financial system as leverage against different countries, be they Russia or China, or of course then Saudi Arabia looks at that and says, fill in my name maybe if I run afoul of U.S. policy. And so they look at that like many other countries around the world and say, could I be in the position where the United States is going to weaponize the dollar against me?
Right.
And if that's the case, then you want to start looking for
Start to
hedges. You
diversify a
want to
bit.
start looking for alternatives, even if they're not as attractive as the dollar.
Right.
So there is a possibility of world events shifting those countries away from the dollar, but it's not because it's uh, a no-brainer for them. It's not because it's a cost-free or better alternative for them. It's because it's a next best alternative. And unfortunately for them, they're finding that the next best alternative really isn't that great of an alternative. So they're sort of stuck.
Right.
But that's for now. So we need to be aware that if we're not good custodians of financial markets, if our sanctions and our pressures are used so excessively that countries start looking and saying, I could be next, they might start to shift away from the dollar.
Right. Well, it's been a fascinating conversation, Patrick. I'm really intrigued by how much Saudi Arabia is tied into so many different issues that relate directly to the U.S. Are there any final comments that you have, any topics that we didn't cover as it relates to Saudi?
I just think that it's the country where it's mostly quiet, it looks stable, and yet when I wake up and look at the headlines, I'm hoping not to see signs of that volcano erupting.
Right.
Hopefully they could somehow manage this very challenging and abrupt transition to a modern economy in ways that don't set off a powder keg.
Right.
And given its size and given its significance in the global economy, that would have ripple effects, which would just be a tsunami.
Yeah.
So we all should hope, as imperfect as the situation there may be, that somehow they navigate their way through the next few decades.
Right. Well, great thoughts as always, Patrick. Really enjoyed the conversation today, and thanks for joining us.